All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. It is quite warm here. The wildflowers are blooming. It's very exciting. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar is titled Ecological Silviculture for Southern Appalachian Hardwood Forests by Tara Kaiser. We're very excited to have you back, and hopefully we can finish this round without any issues. I'm sure we'll be fine. So you are the director of the Center of Forest Restoration and Management with the USDA Forest Service. We'll be introducing Tara a wee bit more later, but I want to remind you guys of a few pre-course items. I would like to start out this week's webinar by sharing NCTC's land acknowledgement. The National Conservation Training Center is located on the ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples. These include, but are not limited to, the Massawomac, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building relationships with indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn more about the lands that we reside in. I'm happy to share a link to those interested where you can learn more about the inhabitants of the land that you live and work on. So just you can slide into the chat and let me know if you want that. I also want to mention that here at NCTC, we welcome all students. It is my intention to create a safe and inclusive and productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas. We are strengthened by diverse perspectives and identities, and we foster an environment where everyone can learn new skills. As such, I will be an ally in the event that anyone experiences access issues or feels unwelcome. So we want you guys to have a good experience here. You may always reach out to me privately to address your concerns. But first, a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. Also, shout out, this webinar is being recorded live and all participants have been muted, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. In the chat, you can go ahead and introduce yourself, where you're from, who you are, what you do. We would love to hear from you. And so you can submit questions into the chat. We will be stopping halfway through the webinar to address questions, and also at the end. Sometimes we go a wee bit over, but we like the discussion. We'll try and be on time this time. So just when you are going to the chat, make sure that you have it set to everyone, not just presenters though, because everyone wants to hear your question and your thoughts. Lastly, this is sort of the best way that you can view the webinar. So you have both wonderful Tara and also our ASL interpreters. If you go down to view, which is the little bunches of squares at the top right hand side of, or the bottom of the Zoom panel, you can see those little squares, and then go to side-by-side gallery. Then you can see everyone and also the wonderful presentation that we're about to see. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Horan. And you're going to tell us a little bit more about the series and introduce our wonderful speaker today. You ready, Jeff?
Thanks, Gwyneth. I'm ready, I think. Yeah. So this series is really a U.S. Fish and Wildlife series, and it's sponsored by our Forest Ecology Working Group, our Science Applications and Migratory Birds programs, and also the National Conservation Training Center. But we have been helped very significantly by USDA's Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. along with the Forest Service. So we appreciate that assistance, and it's really been a nice collaborative effort. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the 5th time we've run a series like this, and we like these 12-month, these kind of 12-part monthly webinar series. They kind of tell a story, and in this case, we're telling a story about how small and large-scale forest disturbances such as fire, wind, ice storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, and introduced endemic pests impact forest ecosystems in a very major way. This series will also examine ecological silviculture and climate adaptation approaches to help inform forest and wildlife habitat management. And before I introduce Tara, I also want to just run a commercial for next month's component, and that's going to be on Tuesday, May 21st, and we're going to have Miranda Curzon from Iowa State University, and she's going to be talking about ecological silviculture for central hardwoods. So today we're hearing about Appalachian hardwoods, and next month we'll hear about central hardwoods. Next slide, please. Thanks. And here's Tara. So some of you guys have already heard this, but at least the beginning. So Dr. Tara Kaiser is a research director, research forester, and director of the Center for Forest Restoration and Management with USDA Forest Service at the Southern Research Station in Asheville, North Carolina, and she runs the Bent Creek experimental forest there. Tara received her BS in Forest Ecology and Management from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and both her MS and PhD in Forest Sciences from Colorado State University. Tara's research is focused on advancing the sustainable management of upland oak ecosystems in the eastern US, and you're going to be hearing about quite a bit of that today. And she has a focus on developing ecologically grounded forestry practices for the conservation and diversity and resiliency to these changing conditions. So I look forward to that today. If you ever get a chance to visit the Southern Experiment Station and Bent Creek Experiment Forest, I recommend it. We've been down there. It's cool business, but you're going to see some of that today. Thanks so much, Tara, for joining us a second time. We got started on this last time, and right at the climax, we lost Zoom altogether. So we left everybody hanging. But thanks so much, Tara, for coming back and being willing to come back and do this again. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. All right, Tara, take it away.
All right. We'll get through the whole thing today, I promise. All right. I'm going to share. And
Nice
thumbs up. That's all good?
All good.
All right. All right. Well, let's jump into it. This is round 2. I got through half of it before, so if you're on and you saw the last one, sorry for the repeat, but we'll get to the end, I promise. So just a quick overview of where we'll be going during this presentation. We'll start out by discussing past land use and the disturbance regime of the Southern Apps, kind of move into contemporary forest conditions, and the issues that we have with managing these forests in an ecological manner, and then end by discussing an ecologically grounded approach to managing these really complex and diverse forests. We're going to define the area here I'll be talking about. There's no solid definition of what Appalachia is. It varies greatly depending on what source you're looking at. So for this talk, I'm pretty confident the topics and principles I'll discuss are really applicable to the parts of the 8 states I have listed here, and wholly or partially, at least within those 8 ecological subsections identified. So it's important to recognize that forests of the Southern Appalachians have been affected by human activity for thousands of years. Oaks became a dominant component of eastern forests as early as 10,000 years ago. By 3,000 years ago, oaks gained dominance. With that point in time, marking the time when indigenous cultures became more agrarian, with widespread and advanced agriculture and settlements that were large and pretty permanent. The use of fire as a tool was extensive during this time period and was used to accomplish numerous objectives. And at this point in time, 3,000 years ago, we really start to see a strong correlation between the amount of char that we see in the soil, soil cores from fire, and the abundance of oak pollen, along with chestnut, hickory, and yellow pine species, all species that we know are sustained through periodic disturbances, including fire. So let's talk briefly about fire as a key disturbance, because we know that fire shaped Appalachian hardwood forests and it occurred relatively frequently, depending on where you were on the landscape. How frequent? Looking at this map, portraying the physical model of fire frequency over here on the left, the fire return interval in Appalachian forests range from about 60 to 40 years, depending on environmental conditions. Again, that's just the physical model of fire. When we look at fire chronology studies, which are more site-specific, the results confirm that physical model of fire in the region, but provide evidence that fire was likely more frequent on the landscape, occurring every 2 years on some of the most fire-prone portions of our landscape, like the xeric ridge tops, to 20, 30, 40 years in some of our more mesic coasts. And the role of fire in these Appalachian forests, it's a relatively new concept. We didn't really start talking about fire in these mesic temperate forests of the eastern US until, like late 1990s, 2000s, when it really took off. So we're really just beginning to understand and appreciate that role of fire. So contact with Europeans in the Appalachians began in that 1500s time period. And the result of that, we all know, it's the depopulation of indigenous peoples. Settlement of the Appalachians by Europeans varied across the region, but really started to increase by the mid to late 1700s. Subsistence living was the dominant, obviously the dominant way in which people made their living, these European settlers, with a typical homestead, a mixture of pasture, row crops, and forest. And that forest provided the fuel or biomass for cooking, heating, and construction. If you're a settler in 1790, I don't think you were cutting down 40-inch chestnuts to heat your home, right? You were likely utilizing smaller diameter material, kind of picking at the forest periodically. And that's important because of the impact that likely had on the forest understory, and really set the stage for the recovery after a dramatic change in land use. What was the composition of the forest during this period of early settlement? Witness trees, with all their inherent biases that come with, particularly the meets and bounds system that was used to delineate ownerships, provide at least a snapshot of forest composition at that early stage of European settlement. These data represent witness tree records from 13 government land survey descriptions in the Southern Appalachians. If we infer that the species used as a witness tree, were representative of their abundance on the landscape, we can kind of see that white oak was likely the most abundant tree species, representing 31% of all the witness trees recorded in that data set. The next most abundant tree that was used as a witness tree was black oak, followed by hickory. One thing that it's clear is that some of our more mesic species, like red maple, sugar maple, black gum, and yellow poplar, were not used as witness trees very often. And that perhaps indicates that the abundance of these species on the landscape was lower than in contemporary forests. By the late 1800s, the area experienced a dramatic and pretty drastic change in the disturbance regime. This period of time, which lasted into the early 1900s, coincided with a period of unregulated timber and resource extraction, right? It wasn't forestry, it wasn't forest management, it was just pure resource extraction. In the early 1900s, for example, it was estimated in Western North Carolina that 50% of the forest land was owned by large companies, and most of that acreage was cleared, burned, or both, with wildfires occurring during this time well outside the historic range of variability in terms of severity and intensity. After that period of widespread logging, land abandonment occurred, right? The land was degraded, there was no value left in that timber, it was abandoned. And the abandonment of that land really removed the ignition sources from the landscape, and fire became less frequent to non-existent. When fires did occur, they were considered detrimental to the growing timber and were quickly suppressed. During this time period, a keystone species, American chestnut, which in the Appalachians accounted for around 30% of the basal area, was functionally eliminated from the landscape due to non-native chestnut blight. After land abandonment, forest regrew, So we had forest recovery, right? And they grew into the forests that dominate the landscape today. During this time, it's interesting, stand level overstory disturbances became relatively infrequent. So this graph on the bottom right shows the frequency of release events documented across 44 white oak forests in the eastern US. And we see that release events, those stand-wide that you can pick up that occurred across the stand, overstory release events, occurred pretty consistently between about 1650 and 1900. After 1900, there was a steady decline in those release events, which impacts kind of the forest today. If we look at the human disturbances that influence species composition and structure of contemporary forests, we see a pretty complex series of disturbances that occurred across broad spatial and temporal scales, really starting with land uses and the relationship that indigenous peoples had with the land, which set the stage for how forests responded to the series of pretty intense and severe disturbances associated with European settlement. Occurring at the same time as those anthropogenic disturbances were all our natural disturbances that occur across the Appalachian landscape, right? They didn't stop occurring because we had all that anthropogenic disturbances. So this includes various types of wind events, from hurricane and tropical storm events to microbursts and tornadoes, ice storms, landslides, oak decline events, which are usually precipitated by drought. So those natural and human disturbances really interact with the diverse environmental conditions that characterize the Southern Apps to influence forest conditions and the diversity of forest communities distributed across the landscape. You know, I did all my graduate work out in the interior West, and I could spend 10 hours walking around the woods doing field work, and I was still in a dry ponderosa pine forest. I can spend a day doing field work here in the Southern Apps and easily move through 8 to 10 pretty unique and diverse ecological zones. So this is really a special place. It's really unlike the diversity found in other temperate hardwood forests. So the Appalachians are heavily forested and contain over 42 million acres of forest land, the vast majority of which, it's important to know, are private lands, right? We're not like the Western US. According to FIA data, oak and hickory forest types dominate the region's forest land, with about 75%, about 25 million acres categorized as some type of oak and hickory forest. The age class distribution of that oak and hickory forest type provide insight kind of into those past land uses. So the graph on the right is an age class distribution of in 20-year increments of that oak and hickory forest type. We can see that only 5% of oak hickory forest land is less than 20 years of age, kind of indicating that cessation of disturbance, while about 70% is greater than 60 years and 35% greater than 80 years. Kind of, again, indicative of that period of disturbance that happened around 1900, late 1800s up into the early 1900s that gave us the forest that we have today. So while historically upland oak hickory and oak pine forests in the Appalachians likely existed in a variety of structural stages across space and time, you know, most oak forests today exist in a structural state highlighted here, right? This is a closed canopy forest, high degree of canopy stratification, which really creates homogeneous structural conditions at stand, landscape, and regional levels. Right? We don't have a lot of young forest habitat. We don't have a lot of the fire-maintained oak savannas and woodlands out there. Most of our forests exist in that closed structural state. So although those synchronous stand-wide overstory disturbances that I talked about have become rare or non-existent, we still have, because our forests are old, right? They're in this stand reinitiation phase of stand development. We have small-scale asynchronous canopy disturbance happening, right? Gaps are forming. And this is the type of disturbance we think of when we think of gap phase dynamics. That is still ongoing in these undisturbed forests. So this type of disturbance is characterized by small gaps created by the mortality of one to a small group of trees. So it's important to know when a canopy gap forms in a closed canopy oak forest, where that low severity disturbance like fire, native grazers that existed before we extirpated them, when those disturbances have been removed, the probability of a shade tolerant individual benefiting from that small gap environment is way greater than that of an intolerant or mid-tolerant species. And our oaks, although there's variation among the species and their relative tolerance to shade, they are all what we kind of refer to as mid-tolerant species. So these data with species on the y-axis and stems per acre on the x-axis show the response of the regeneration layer to canopy gaps. And these gaps were created by some drought-related mortality up in southeastern Ohio. And we can see it's clear from these data that small gaps created in these long, undisturbed forests facilitate the growth and recruitment of shade-tolerant species like beech, maple, black gum, with our mid-tolerant oaks and hickories clearly at a disadvantage. In comparison, when these asynchronous gaps are created in close successional oak forests that have experienced that low severity periodic disturbance, and in the case of these data right here, was 5 prescribed burns conducted over the course of 10 years, the outcomes are more favorable for oaks and hickories. In this case, the repeated fires likely maintain more open understory conditions, right? Oaks are mid-tolerant, they need some light, which over time allowed those disturbance-adapted oak and hickories to grow to a size where, when that gap was created, that small gap was created, they were in a position to capture that growing space. So these data provide some pretty strong evidence about how prior disturbance is really critical to the success of oak and hickory. So the process by which later successional mesic species are replacing our disturbance adapted species like oak, hickories, and yellow pines is termed mesification. And this process not only leads to changes in species composition, but also function, with mesification really being a self-reinforcing process whereby once started, it really promotes further establishment and recruitment of like species, right? Those shade-tolerant, water-loving species. So a recent analysis quantified the severity of mesification across eastern US forests. So this was a region-wide analysis using FIA data, and the highlighted boxes show the results specific to the central hardwood region, which encompasses that Southern Appalachian area. So the y-axis is the difference in the community-weighted mean values of drought, fire, and shade tolerance of the overstory versus the mid-story, right? Those suppressed and intermediate size classes, with movement upward or above that 0 line on the y-axis, really indicating progressively more severe mesification. And the take home here is that if the mid-story stratum really is poised to capture growing space following some type of overstory disturbance, drought, wind, wildfire, our forests are going to become less drought tolerant, less fire tolerant, and more shade tolerant than the existing overstory that we have. Another key take home from this analysis was that as stand age increased, so as stands got older, the severity or degree of mesification increased. And so given that most of our forests in the Southern Apps are in those older age classes, they therefore often possess a really high degree of mesification. So the species responsible for mesification, they're the usual culprits. These figures show the change in individual species importance values between 1980 and 2005 using FIA data. Red indicates a decline in importance and green indicates a gain of importance. So supporting that idea of mesification, we see a pretty substantial decline in the importance of oaks, hickories, and even some of our xeric pines, while red maple and black gum and even cherry to some degree are showing significant increases in importance. So why does this matter? Who cares? Turns out the numerous factors of threatening the sustainability of oak are pretty hot topics, whether it's a popular news article, lots of scientific literature coming out. And it's as well a focus of some federal legislation. We have a bipartisan White Oak Caucus in Congress, and we have a White Oak Resilience Act introduced into Congress. So people are recognizing this issue in the sustainability of our oak and hickory resources. And the concern about that sustainability of oak really has to do with the services and benefits these forests and these species in particular provide. The easiest way to grasp what these forests give us are really those provisioning services, ecosystem services, the things we get from the woods, right? The things we utilize. Some are traditional, timber, fiber, especially now with the focus on white oak and the spirits industry. But we get a lot of non-timber forest products and medicinal products from our oak hickory forests as well. Probably one of the most important services that we think of in terms of, being related to forest land, but not necessarily species, is water. So the Southern Appalachian region alone provides water supplies for up to 10 million people in major urban areas of the Southeast. And we know research from the Coweta Hydrological Lab in Western North Carolina found that after accounting for changes in climate and any changes in structure, right, like densification, that mesification, that increase in mesic water-loving species of forests can reduce annual water yield in a watershed by as much as 18%. And that's because on an average summer day, again, some sap flux data from Coweta, we know a 12-inch red maple pulls 17 gallons of water from the soil every day and uses that, whereas a white oak of similar size uses only 5 gallons of water per day. So that means that as these mesic species grow and recruit into these larger size classes and increase in abundance, that is less water in your streams, rivers, and ultimately reservoirs, which is a really big deal because we are going to experience drought, and the Southeast is one of the most rapidly growing populations in the country. So all of that is really important to consider when we think about managing our forests and species. Other ecosystem services, the mesification of forests have implications for a wide range of services, including a reduction in carbon sequestration and storage potential, particularly during times of water stress. Oak and hickory forests also provide numerous supporting and cultural ecosystem services too, with that slow reduction in oaks and subsequent decline of, say, acorn production, which is a fundamental keystone forest food resource, really posing a risk for the game and non-game species that rely on or at least benefit from acorns as a food resource. And I will take a quick break for some questions. I'll just point out this is a pitch pine being strangled by 2 red maples. So.
Thanks, Tara. So that's really great. So the mesification issue is really, it's a big one. So I do see there's a question in here. So while you guys, we'll just take a question or two here, but if you have one, you can quickly put it in the chat and we will either take it now or at the end. So there is a question from Robbie, and it is the water use estimates from iTree tools, the water use that you got, the red maple pulling 17 gallons versus, I think you said red oak or maybe white oak pulls 5 gallons per day.
So no, I got those data from Dr. Chris Alici, who's an ecologist at Coweta, who has a lot of sap flux studies out there and data. So I emailed him and asked him to give me some water use data, and so that is where those data come from. I've never played around with iTree, so I'm not sure where those data come from.
Okay, and so Tara, also, so you and I have discussed this a little bit. So when you look at this, when you look at the climate change atlas developed by the U.S. Forest Service and NIAX and others, I really like the process that was used for that atlas, but it seems to indicate oak taking over the world. Certainly you look into New England, it's clearly moving up, and that's the predictions there. But you and I discussed that really it's really hard to regenerate oak based on the issues you're showing. So why the disconnect?
Yeah, I think it's right. So the climate change atlas is looking at the traits of the trees, and it is not predicting success. It is predicting, so this graph here, or the table, it's predicting a change in suitable habitat. So we think, chestnut oak, for example, has high adaptability, and under various climate change scenarios, right, the low versus high, that is a change in habitat. So there might be a large increase in, or a small increase in habitat, potential habitat, but that doesn't mean that, the tree will be there, or that doesn't mean that the management activities needed to ensure that tree's success are taking place. It is just modeling kind of that physical, the habitat, looks to be better or worse for some of these species.
Okay, and I will give you this one more question here,
Yeah.
and I think it's pretty related. And so Amy asks, how does the proliferation of invasive species fit into this equation?
Huge. Invasive species fit into just about any forest management conversation, regardless of the system you're working in. You almost can't even think about how to manage for this desirable species, ecological or economic, that you're trying to manage for if you've got an invasive problem, right? And so that is just in my world of researching on public lands management alternatives, that's just a gimme, right? If we are walking into a place and it is covered in bittersweet, we can't even begin to think about what management, what silviculture, what tool can we use to get oak in a competitive state. We have to deal with the invasives first. And so that's rough. That is not a one and done thing. That is, you are in there with chemical quite a bit, right? Before you can even start to think about silvicultural activities. And we can go into the same type of detriment that invasives have on all of our ecosystem services. So they are there. They're not going away. We will have more. And it is just a recognition that you can't even begin to think about management until you've handled your invasive species on that particular piece of land.
All right, thanks a lot, Tara. So we'll hold the rest of the questions. So folks can enter their questions now, but we'll hold those till you're finished. And nice that you had a slide already to answer.
I know. Well, we'll start with that. So, lucky for us, the likely winners of the climate change in the Southern Apps look to be, in terms of potential habitat and their adaptability to future climate, the oaks and hickories. And these species currently dominate, right, the current landscape. The fact that these species are more resilient than mesic species really provides incentives for us to develop effective management strategies that can sustain the forests that we have, either sustain them or regenerate new oak and hickory forests in the future. And again, so this is output from the Climate Tree Atlas. This is from the Blue Ridge Mountains section of the eastern U.S. Out of the species that we have listed here as currently abundant or common in the Blue Ridge Mountains, only 4 have poor capability to adapt under more extreme climate change scenarios, and those sweet birch, eastern hemlock, which has an invasive species issue, along with that Fraser magnolia and red spruce, which is already a refugia from the last glaciation. So whereas oaks and hickories are projected to have small to large increases in habitat suitability. It doesn't mean they're just going to thrive there, but habitat suitability, and are rated as having a good to very good capability to cope with that changing climate. So it's really, just in addition to all the ecosystem services that they provide, the fact that they are projected to be resilient and kind of winners of that future climate just even drives home even more the need to manage these complex forests. So we've established that oaks and hickories benefit from and likely rely on frequent disturbance. So the success of them. So both oaks and hickories, as well as many of the other species in the Southern Apps and eastern hardwood forests in general, are mid-tolerant shade and are advanced growth dependent. And what that means, that is, if an oak isn't in your stand prior to some type of overstory disturbance in the form of advanced reproduction, which are just seedlings in the understory right now, or stump sprout potential, they're not just going to magically show up in your stand after that disturbance. Meaning successful oak regeneration really depends on 2 things: sprouting from mature trees and the existence of oak seedlings and saplings prior to disturbance. If you don't have those 2 things and you're trying to manage for oak, go to a different place. So this figure shows how seedling size is related to the probability of an oak seedling being successful after an overstory disturbance. And successful is going to be defined as being dominant or co-dominant at the time of crown closure, which in a really productive Southern Appalachian forest can be in as little as 5 years after overstory disturbance. On a more xeric site, you might be at 15 to 20 years for crown closure. And what we see in this figure is the positive relationship between seedling size pre-disturbance on the x-axis and the probability of success on the y-axis. However, that relationship is inversely related to site productivity, which here is defined by site index. So what that means is that for any given seedling size, the probability of being successful is greater on a lower quality site than a higher quality site due to that intense competition and just the sheer number of increased species present on those more productive sites. So let's take a look at what happens to oak seedlings without any disturbance. On the left is a figure that displays the survival of a cohort of newly established oak seedlings on the y-axis, and without disturbance, only 10% of that pretty large oak seedling cohort survives after 10 years. The figure on the right is a little bit more shocking. The figure on the right displays the total height, not height increment, but total height of those seedlings that survived, right? This shows that a year after establishment, oaks are about a foot tall. And if you're lucky enough to survive, you're a whopping 1 foot tall at the end of 10 years, right? Oaks just simply do not grow in the understory of undisturbed conditions. And that's because the 5% of sunlight that generally hits the forest floor in a mature undisturbed oak forest is about the compensation point for oaks, which is the light level at which carbon gain during photosynthesis equals carbon loss during respiration. So they are just hanging on in that undisturbed condition. So these data are from a stand in Western North Carolina and shows the relative abundance of species in a typical kind of pretty productive stand, mixed oak stand. And we see oaks and hickories are abundant in the overstory diameter classes, as well as occupy a pretty substantial proportion of the seedling strata. We often actually have thousands of oak seedlings per acre out there in undisturbed conditions. They're just really tall, or I mean really, really small. There's a bottleneck, however, where there is either little to no oak and hickory in the competitive sapling and mid-story size classes, or their abundance is extremely low relative to that of shade-tolerant mesozoic species. So I like to equate this to human demographics. We have lots of parents and grandparents, oaks and hickories in that older size, larger size classes. We often have lots of babies. We often have lots of oak and hickory seedlings in the understory. We don't have any teenagers, right? We don't have any of those larger sapling, smaller pulpwood size oaks and hickories underneath that canopy to take over when a disturbance occurs. So when we have a seedling pool like this, and we end up having a severe punctuated disturbance, whether it's a regeneration harvest or a wind event, let's say, seedlings of either those shade tolerant species grab all the available growing space, or more likely here in the Southern Apps, if the disturbance is severe enough, new seedlings of shade intolerant species like sweet birch, black cherry, or yellow poplar establish, and by crown closure have outcompeted those thousands of oak seedlings per acre that were in your stand at the time of disturbance, and essentially have ensured dominance throughout the next rotation. So really quickly, because I mentioned stump sprouts, just a quick slide on stump sprouts. Oak stump sprouts are more competitive than oak seedlings. However, and that's because, right, they're growing off an already established root system, carbohydrate reserve. So this figure presents the probability of sprouting on the y-axis as a function of diameter at breast height. And it shows there's an inverse probability of sprouting as the size or age of oak stems increase. So that decline in sprouting probability varies across the oak species. However, if you look at white oak, which is the red line, the drop in sprout potential is the most precipitous of the oak species. Once the stem exceeds about 8 inches in diameter, that's not all that big, the probability of that tree, if it is cut, producing a sprout drops below 50%. That relationship between stem size and sprouting does not exist for many of the oak competitors. For example, regardless of tree size, yellow poplar is going to sprout 80% of the time, beech 93% of the time, black gum 72% of the time. So if we're relying on sprout potential of our really large oak, big oaks, we're going to be disappointed in what that outcome is. So wrap up all this information into some basic tenets of oak regeneration. 1, oaks must be in your stand before any type of management or disturbance occurs. Do not rely on stump sprouts because most of our oaks in our forests are old or large and have a low probability of sprouting. Maybe we could have relied on sprouts 40 years ago as a reliable regeneration source, but it is not a reliable source today. Number 3, oak seedlings should be considered your primary source of regeneration, and they should be present in adequate numbers. What's adequate? No idea. The more, the better is what I always say. It's going to vary with your goals and objectives. Number 4, low to moderate severity disturbance at points in stand development prior to a regeneration event are necessary for small oak seedlings to grow into those competitive. And when I say competitive, before I go and do any type of regen harvest or management action, I want oak seedlings to be at least breast high. If I'm on a really productive site, I want 6 feet. I want 7 feet. The larger, the better. And to get those competitive oak seedlings, right, ultimately, that's about managing your understory lights. Number 5, canopy disturbances that release competitive oak regeneration must occur if oaks are going to recruit into progressively higher canopy positions, right? They're not just going to sit there in a suppressed state for 50 years. They have to have that release event happen. And number 6, ongoing disturbance is going to be necessary at varied times and spatial scales to sustain and ensure recruitment. Right, with oak, it is not a one and done for oak and hickory. You are going to have to be in that stand every 5, every 10 years up through age 30, maybe longer if you're on a productive stand, to really secure that oak regeneration. So we can use the disturbance regime that facilitated the establishment of our current oak and hickory forests as a recipe for how to manage our contemporary forests. I like to use the word recipe in lieu of blueprint because with the recipe, especially a cooking recipe and not necessarily a baking recipe where you have to be super specific, we can take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and hopefully achieve a desired result. So we know the disturbance regime that perpetuated these forests is based on frequent low severity disturbances punctuated by intermediate disturbances or release events that affect that canopy. These intermediate disturbances were, for the most part, partial disturbances that really act at a substand scale. And because they rarely removed all the canopy trees, conserve that ecological memory, those legacies from one stand to the next. The partial disturbances that created canopy gaps of various shapes and sizes were and still are an integral component of the disturbance regime. And depending on the structure and composition of that forest understory at the time of gap formation, really create opportunities for the recruitment of the most shade intolerant species that we have, like yellow poplar, to the most shade tolerant ones in the region, like red maple, which we don't really necessarily need to create more opportunities, but just saying those gaps can, if the understory is in a good state, create the opportunities for the regeneration of our full suite of species. We know we have to manage understory light prior to disturbance, and we can manage that in a variety of ways. We can use repeated fire, right? It's kind of a blunt tool, but we can do that. We can use thinning, and we can do mid-story removal. That mid-story removal is a phrase we use here in the region to describe the removal of kind of non-merchantable, undesirable species in the forest understory. Think red maple, black. I hate to label things as undesirable because every species has a function, but those that we have a plethora of them, and we're not too worried about how they recruit. Think of those species, anything occupying kind of the 1 to 10 inch size class or so. We can remove those through targeted herbicide stem injection treatments. We can manage release events through regeneration harvests, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then finally, we know we must manage competition after the harvest. And again, we can do that using a variety of methods and tools. The methods and tools are the same methods and tools that we've had in our toolbox for a long time. Prescribed fire, mechanical release, chemical release treatments. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on the release part of regeneration through planned regeneration harvest. I'm going to focus on one particular application of the irregular shelterwood system, which has applicability to forests affected by partial disturbance, like temperate eastern hardwood forests. There are different variants of the irregular shelterwoods described. This article does an amazing job at describing the differences of these systems. And I really think the expanding gap, or that Bavarian Feldschlag in particular, has applicability in our complex mixed oak forests, given the importance of gaps, both large and small, in our forests. So this is a depiction of that expanding gap Femelschlag variant of the irregular shelterwood system. The red represents the mature forest and the green represents the regenerating forest. In this type of system, groups are created much like you would do in a traditional group selection system during that first entry. What's different is during the second entry, instead of going and creating a brand new set of spatially independent or distinct groups in this expanding gap system, you go back to those original groups and expand them in some pattern around that original opening. Again, a set time period later, or maybe not a set time period, maybe it's adaptive and you're just looking at the regeneration and deciding to go in. You re-enter that stand and expand those openings yet again. This can go on until that entire stand is regenerated, as the diagram demonstrates, or stop whenever goals and objectives have really been achieved. So why is this Bavarian Femelschlag something we'd even consider implementing in the oak and hickory forest? It's all about life on the edge. And I like to say it's the edge of that gap environment. So gaps create heterogeneity in environmental conditions, particularly light. And this figure shows absolute values of photosynthetically active radiation across 3 distinct zones of a gap: the center of the gap, the edges of the gap, and then the forest matrix. As expected, the greatest amount of light availability is in the center of the gap, with that light availability really only slightly decreasing as you approach that gap edge. As you do get to that gap edge, elevated light conditions continue before it diminishes to levels typically observed under an intact canopy. With the greatest light penetration in a gap in the northern hemisphere, right, occurring in those northern edge environments. That means that there's some spatially explicit area around the openings. Maybe some evidence as great as 60 feet or so, where light is really conducive to the development of oaks and hickories and other mid-tolerant species. And that light may be low enough to inhibit the growth of aggressive shade intolerant species. With the appropriate silvicultural system, like an expanding gap system, we could theoretically take advantage of that light environment that we get by simply creating gaps. So patterns of tree regeneration support the idea that light in the edge environment facilitates the development of competitive oak and hickory. These figures are from data collected by David Schnocke, who's a PhD student at NC State. And these data show the response of tree regeneration to group selection harvesting in 13-year-old harvested gaps. So these are 13-year gaps. These figures show areas where competitive oaks and hickories are located in group openings. The red indicates kind of a hot spot for oak and hickory, and the blue colors indicate cold spots where competitive oak and hickory are lacking. So these data provide that evidence that high densities of dominant and codominant oak hickory saplings were spatially clustered in kind of that northwestern portions of the edges of those 13-year-old gaps. It's interesting, we have data from 30-year-old gaps too. We did not find this spatial patterning in 30-year-old gaps, indicating that perhaps oaks and hickories may be able to be regenerated using gaps. If those species benefiting from that light environment, the oaks and hickories, are released at least before 30 years of age, given we didn't find this patterning at 30 years of age. Again, highlighting the need to think about that release event. It's not enough just to develop the oak and hickory competitive regeneration, you have to release it too. So what does all this look like in real life? I'm going to describe a study. We designed to test the efficacy of an expanding gap-based Femelschlag system to regenerate oaks and hickories in a really productive Appalachian mixed oak forest in Western North Carolina. This is by no means the only way to implement this system. I'll say how we did it. It had to be statistically sound. If you were going out and doing this out in the real world without a science question, you know, you do things a little differently in terms of you didn't need replication, things like that. But one of the nice things about this system is that it's flexible and can really be modified to fit varied operational or ecological conditions. Our Appalachian Femelschlag was really informed by the observed success of oak and hickory around edges of both natural and silvicultural openings. So we implemented this system on a 150-acre stand on the Pisgah National Forest, where about 50% of the basal area was in oak. Site index averaged about 85 per oak, and that's base age 50. So this was a really productive site where securing oak regeneration in any amount would be really challenging. So the idea here was to use gaps, common theme of the disturbance regime, to regenerate these oak and hickory forests and reintroduce some structural complexity and diversity into these even-age kind of closed canopy forests. So we regenerated using 2 gap sizes. Small gap was 1/4 of an acre and represents kind of the upper limit of a gap size created during normal gap phase dynamics in some old growth mesic hardwood forests of the region. The large gap was a 1 acre gap and represented the median gap size created during a Hurricane Opal back in 1994 in Western North Carolina. So kind of using the natural disturbance to guide our gap size. About 33% of the acreage, after considering the land we had to take out for road construction and daylighting, ended up being regenerated in those respective gaps. So we have like 70 gaps out there in this 150 acre stand. Gaps were harvested in site prep, included the slash down of all non-merchantable stems less than 8 inches in diameter, except for where species important to wildlife occurred. So if we had any, 6-inch oak out there or hickory out there, we did not go and site prep them. I will say out of the 70 gaps, we had 1 oak tree that did out there in that size range as a reserve tree. Again, highlighting that bottleneck of oak regeneration in that size class. I think if I could go back in time, that would be one of my do-overs. I think I'd like to have kept some ecological, right, some legacy, especially in those larger 1 acre gaps. Immediately after the harvest, we conducted that mid-story removal throughout the forest matrix outside of the gaps. So this was done through chemical injection of those undesirable species between 2 and 8 inches in diameter. We used chemical because we wanted to stop sprouting of these undesirable species. The removal of these smaller diameter mesic and shade tolerant species create a slightly more open understory, one that may have likely mimicked the structure of these productive forests if frequent fire had been operating in the stand, right? If frequent fire had been operating in the stand over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years, we wouldn't have had so many red maple, right? 4-inch red maple or 6-inch dogwood in the stand. So 3 years after harvest, the response of the vegetation within the gap is pretty much as expected. Rapid resprouting of, again, mostly non-oak species because our oaks were big and they just didn't sprout. New yellow poplar seedlings dominated gaps, and then rubus really dominated inside of those gaps. So typical, really rapid response to disturbance that we typically see in the Southern Appalachians. However, in the edge environment, we see a pretty different response. Although those shade intolerant and aggressive competitors did establish in that edge environment, it was not as competitive as it was in full sunlight. And the oaks and hickories in the forest adjacent to those gaps, particularly on the northwestern to northeastern orientations, were able to take advantage of that increased light, as well as likely increased duration of that higher intensity light, right? We think that facilitated a pretty substantial increase in growth and competitiveness in that edge environment. In addition to the growth of oak and hickory, we began to see an increase in understory diversity and abundance in that edge environment as well. So as those early successional species in the gap, those understory species establish and quickly kind of die out because canopy closure happens so fast. In that edge environment, you kind of hang on to those early successional species longer, benefiting various pollinators, etc. The photos on the right show the positive effects of oak in the edge environment of a gap-based femoral log system on DuPont State Recreational Forest in Western North Carolina. So this is being done outside of research, right? People are implementing these out on the ground just based on what we are seeing observationally in response at the Appalachian Femoral Log Study. So these are nice views. It's leaf off, and with the oaks retaining their leaves in the winter, you can really see the response of the oaks along the gap edges. So these oaks are competitive size classes, and when they're released through the next expansion, should compete with the seaborge and yellow poplar and any shade tolerant species that are shorter than those oaks and hickories. So if we continue to see the development of competitive oak and hickory in this edge environment, we plan to expand the gaps as early as 2027. This expansion of gaps is a natural phenomenon, right? You have wind throw, you have insect and disease agents that really cause that can naturally cause mortality of trees adjacent to gaps and naturally expand gaps over time. So the plan at this point would be to have 2 expansions, which would result in a stand with 4 age classes. The openings created in 2019, the expansion in 2027, the expansion in 2037, I will not be around for that, and then a legacy age class that will be represented by mature forests in inoperable areas of the stand, riparian areas, and any slivers of mature forest that are just not efficient to harvest. The amount of the expansion is going to be determined by the response of the desirable regeneration, with some gaps perhaps being expanded only in one kind of orientation or aspect, while others may have a more complete expansion around that original opening. This expansion won't be dictated by area or volume control, but it's going to be adaptive and guided by the site conditions and the response to that regeneration. Release treatments, including control of undesirable sprouts from harvested trees that can quickly capture newly created growing space, the continued release of oak and hickory that were released during expansions through crown touch release treatments are going to continue to be necessary. It is never a one and done for oak. Burning is an option and could be done, but in this particular stand, or the control lines are adequate. I think in Indiana, they are burning some of their expanding gap systems. In this particular area of the Southern Appalachians, where we have the Appalachian Femmelschlag, it's a very productive site. Repeated fire is going to absolutely be necessary, with a missed fire interval possibly setting back competitiveness of oak and hickory due to competition and the fact that this is such a productive site. And one thing that we've learned from the 25 years of fire and oak research now is that one fire without the ability to repeatedly burn can be more of a detriment to oak hickory regeneration than no fire at all. So fire is definitely a process missing from that component and definitely should be considered depending on goals and objectives. Numerous benefits associated with this expanding gap Femmelschlag. One, in an area where diversity and complexity are the norm instead of uncommon, it's important to have a flexible system that can easily be adapted to local conditions and modified as conditions change, because conditions and goals and objectives change. The system appears to facilitate the regeneration and improvement of species across that shade tolerant spectrum. This conservation of diversity is important within the context of climate change, where greater diversity and functional traits can increase response diversity to disturbance. Expanding gap Femmelschlag ultimately creates a shifting mosaics of structural stages and associated wildlife habitat within the stand. This increased age class diversity, especially when the age classes are comprised of desirable oak and hickory species, again, can increase resilience to disturbance and maintain key ecosystem services like wildlife habitat, among others, over time. Some other benefits include less soil disturbance because you're using the same skid, forwarding, and road system. Relevant to private landowners, this type of system provides a periodic source of revenue and is also definitely more aesthetically pleasing than some of our even age silvicultural practice. And although I just want to say the benefits appear to be great, this is not the end all be all solution for oak regeneration in the Appalachians or anywhere. It's simply another tool in what is a really pretty limited oak silvicultural toolbox. So increasing those tools and our understanding of our management options is really important. Potential drawbacks that you should at least consider: as with any partial harvesting system, there can be logging damage due to residual overstory, to the residual overstory and developing reproduction. In terms of damage to future sawlog trees, we're coming back in within 8 to 10 years of the initial cut. So that is going to reduce the likelihood that any type of rot takes hold and value is lost from any logging damage. So it normally takes a little bit longer for that defect to set in. The growth of the regeneration can be slower than under an even age system. I'm not concerned about that at all from an ecological perspective. Balance was never the goal. It was never the intended goal. In mountainous areas like the Appalachians, and expanding gap Femmelschlag is going to be limited to ground-based systems, which in our neck of the woods are where slopes are about less than 40%. So you're limited in your topography. Obviously, the road network is ultimately going to decide where you can operate, but 40% is a pretty good run-of-the-mill estimate for where you can do this. And finally, the system requires a long-term logging plan. It has to be developed in advance of that first harvest to ensure future entries, right, aren't plowing, you're not skidding through recently regenerated parts of the stand. This is just communication from all people involved, which in our case was the researchers, the National Forest System silviculturists, timber management assistants, contracting officers, and road engineers. So they're used to it now. This was something new, so it took a lot of communication, but that communication and guideline wasn't a steep hill to climb to figure out how we're going to implement such a complex silvicultural system here. And I think with that, Jeff, I am done.
Way to go, Tara. That was really interesting, and thanks. And you ended right at 2, so
perfect.
Way to go. And we kept you the whole time, so that was great. So there are a couple questions in here.
All right.
And so I'm going to leave the Femmerschlag for a second and go back to Amy's question. And
Okay.
this still again, we're still talking about, how do we keep these oak systems and regenerate them? She says, anecdotally, it seems that the Blue Ridge is burning more often. What do the data say?
So the Blue Ridge is burning more often in terms of prescribed fire or wildfire? Quick.
Yeah, she did not.
Okay. Yeah, definitely.
I
think as our understanding about how the role of fire in our hardwood systems and maintaining desirable species over time, as that just continues to develop, we continue, right, to increase our prescribed burning. I'll just say on public lands, for sure, state, federal lands, we have increased our prescribed burning operations in the Blue Ridge a ton, right, especially as we get more partners involved. And it's not just ecological too, right? It's a fuels reduction and wildfire risk activity too. So as that WUI expands, even just from a public safety perspective, right, we have increased our burning to help make our forest more fire safe.
Yeah, and I see Ted says it's really not Amy, it's me. Sorry, Mr. Weber. Good to have you on though. All right, and so now back to the Femmerschlag. So this question is from Brad, and he's saying, okay, when applying in the Appalachian Femmerschlag, did you place gaps where regen was present? If not, might you consider that approach?
So I'll just say I was not there for the marking of the stand. And there was 2 reasons. One, I was recovering from hip surgery and couldn't walk. But 2, I didn't want my researcher fingers all over it. I wanted the folks who would operationalize this outside of a study to be the ones responsible for the marking. So they went out and did the marking, which included the placement of the original gaps. And they pretty much did it on a systematic basis. So, they did not in particular look for pockets of oak regeneration. But yes, if you were going to go do this outside of a study, I would go look for a pocket of regeneration, right? There's a beautiful patch of 2-foot tall white oak seedlings out there. I would not put my gap smack dab in the middle of it because I know those 2-foot seedlings are going to get outcompeted. What I do is make that be my northern, right? Make that be the edge of that gap, right? And so we've got silviculturists out on the districts who are changing up the shapes. So ours were kind of irregularly shaped, but they're looking at maximizing that northern edge, right? So placing them east-west, making them more oval, kind of maximizing getting the biggest bang from your buck from that edge. So definitely.
All right. So again, I think you tried very hard to answer the question or encourage us to do more management activities. So to address this moderate to low disturbance that we're getting. but it seems like it would be really challenging economically to enter the stand so many times. And again, I'm seeing how difficult it is here in the Northeast. So can we implement this economically on the landscape?
Yeah, I think, so you have, so public lands, that generally is not an issue because how we sell to are right, it's bundled. And so it's kind of all a wash. I will say this 150 acres, and in total, I think we had about 33 acres of gaps that would have sold standalone, right? So it's a productive site. So it was fantastic, high quality timber. So that would have sold by itself. Not everybody has site index 85, 90 beautiful oak stands. And so that's where it becomes challenging. Again, on public lands, you can bundle some of those timber sales together, so I'm not worried about that. Private lands management, you're not going to implement this if you own 25 acres. It's kind of the economy of scale. You're going to have to, in order for it to pay, you're going to have a good chunk of land, right, in order to get the revenue out during that initial harvest, and make the subsequent entries profitable. I will say I've had private landowners come out and change up their management plans to implement this. They're larger, right? They've got a couple hundred acres to play around with, so that's doable. And markets is always going to be an issue and kind of the limitation on what's feasible and what's not. We just had one of our pulpwood markets closed because the paper mill went away, and now we don't have a place to go with red maple less than 15 inches, right? It's all pulpwood that we can't do anything with. So that's always a limitation. Whenever I think about the threats to the health and sustainability of oak and hickory forests, or just forests in general, I always call markets one of those threats. If we don't have a market, we can't implement, right? We can't do a great job at restoring our forests. Our toolbox becomes even more limited.
Yeah, that's great. And I see Amanda Mahaffey in the chat has said that in Western Pennsylvania, she's given a link for a group that is implementing the Pemmelschlag system in Western PA. And of course, that's a great place to grow oak. So
is it the Foundation for Sustainable Forestry?
It is. And so
I just went up and gave a talk at one of their dinners last year. So yeah.
Yeah, and of course Amanda's picture was in there with Bob Seymour in your slides earlier.
Yes.
That's Amanda with the Stewards Guild. With U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So hey, Amanda. So at any rate, that's it. We're not going to take any more. But I saw there were questions from a number of folks related to, will Tara's slides be available? And we will PDF those and along with the recording on the Climate Hub site. And so and Gwyneth provided that link, and maybe you can just throw it up there one more time, Gwyneth, if you don't mind, so people have the link to the site where they can see all the recordings of the series. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and we got through it, Tara. It was awesome material. We really talked about regenerating stuff that was really, in these forest systems. So perfect presentation. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you.